Democratic socialism is like a dating profile. Things look great until you meet up in the real world. For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor in the Oval Office last week. But the DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy.
The Democratic Socialists are at it again, and once more, Maher steps in to pick apart their arguments with sharp, unfiltered precision. Recently, Bernie Sanders stirred the pot by reigniting his push to heavily tax the wealthy, sparking another wave of heated debate. But Maher wasn't having any of it. He came back with his trademark mix of humor and biting criticism, tearing through the talking points in a way that was as entertaining as it was cutting. Oh, if you're into bold political commentary with a dose of satire and no shortage of strong opinions, stick around. Let's jump right into it.
American economy, to me, I know I've said this before, I still don't get it. Last week was tax day, and as usual, because HBO is so generous, and I'm sure so will be the new owners, I paid to the government, if you add in state tax, local, sales, property, fees, Obamacare, probably almost 60% of what I earned. That's a lot, and I still wouldn't mind if Bernie Sanders would stop saying the rich don't pay taxes. And while I'm sure the super rich with their army of accountants and corporate loopholes get away with murder, us regular rich people pay a shit ton of taxes. And who stands up and gives us a pat on the back? Nobody, that's who.
Maher comes out of the gate strong, and he's not exactly playing defense. Instead of staying in the abstract, he turns the conversation inward and uses his own situation as a reference point. He reportedly earns around $10 million a year, and here's the part that really grabs attention. He claims that roughly 60% of it already goes to taxes. That means a huge chunk of his income disappears before it ever reaches his account. Oh, when Bernie Sanders argues that the wealthy aren't paying their fair share, Maher's personal example seems to complicate that narrative. If someone at his income level is already losing more than half of what he earns, it naturally raises a tougher question. At what point is it considered enough? That tension becomes the core of the debate, and Maher leans into it, framing his own experience as a direct challenge to the broader political argument.
The top 10% pay 72% of all federal income taxes, and the bottom half, 3%. The Democratic Socialists talk about socialism like we don't already have a lot. Social Security, unemployment, Medicare, nutritional assistance, Medicaid, Obamacare, disability, housing subsidies. Again, not against it, just the same question. How can you be soaking the rich and failing the poor so badly?
And that's where the argument really heats up. Maher claims the wealthy are already paying a massive share. Figures like 72% of earnings going to taxes get thrown around in this kind of debate, meant to highlight just how heavily top earners are already contributing. The point he's driving at is simple. If such a large portion of income is being funneled into the system, then people start asking what impact it's actually having. On the other side of the discussion, broader economic data paints a different picture of inequality. Reports from institutions like the Federal Reserve show that wealth remains heavily concentrated, with the bottom half of Americans holding only a small fraction of total national wealth. At the same time, tens of millions of people continue to live near or below the poverty line, despite extensive government spending on welfare and anti-poverty programs. That's where the tension sits. If significant resources are being collected and redistributed, why does inequality persist at such a deep level? Is the issue the amount of money being collected, or how effectively it's being used once it enters the system? It's a debate that doesn't have an easy answer, and it's exactly why it keeps coming back into the political spotlight.
That on 60 Minutes last week, they were redoing the story they did 18 years ago about remote area medical. That is the program modeled after medical teams that drop into the poorest countries in the world for a few days to set up a tent where people with no access to health care can get some. And now we're one of those countries. Doctors within borders.
The pressure isn't just hitting those at the bottom. It's increasingly squeezing the middle class as well. The group that once represented economic stability in America is now facing a very different reality. Rising living costs, wages that haven't kept pace, and financial strain that feels harder to escape year after year. At the same time, there's a growing contrast between America's global role and its internal challenges. A country long known for sending large-scale aid abroad and supporting international relief efforts is now seeing more of that need appear at home. Local support systems, food banks, community programs, and charities are reporting higher demand, with many struggling to keep up. T creates a striking shift in perception. Resources that once flowed outward are increasingly being redirected inward. And while the causes are complex, ranging from economic cycles to policy decisions and demographic changes, the result is a growing sense of strain across multiple layers of society. For many observers, that contrast raises an important question about priorities and sustainability. How a system that once projected strength abroad can ensure stability for its own people at home.
How can it be that the federal government alone took in over $5 trillion in taxes last year, and we still need that? Are we really this incompetent and corrupt? Don't answer that. Whatever it is, somehow the ultra-rich keep getting ultra-richer, while a growing percentage is feeling truly desperate. You just wouldn't know it because everyone on TV is rich. Reality TV, rich women day drinking. Drama, rich women whose friend got murdered. Comedy, rich men shouting into cell phones.
If you've followed Maher over the past year, none of this will sound unfamiliar, because he's been consistent in pushing a broader critique. His argument, stripped down, is that the issue isn't only about how much is taxed, but how effectively that money is spent once it's collected. The federal government brings in trillions in revenue each year, yet major indicators of inequality and hardship, poverty rates, housing insecurity, and the shrinking middle class, remain persistent problems. That disconnect is what fuels the debate over whether the core issue is funding, allocation, or structural inefficiency. States like California are often used as examples in this discussion. Despite some of the highest tax burdens in the country, they still face significant challenges such as housing shortages, visible homelessness, and cost of living pressures. Supporters of higher taxation argue that these problems are the result of scale and complexity, while critics point to them as evidence that increased revenue alone doesn't automatically translate into better outcomes. To the center of it all is a simple but difficult question. If more money is consistently flowing into the system, why do so many of the same problems remain unresolved?
He seems like a nice guy, and I congratulate him on an extraordinary political achievement. But before the whole left side of the country catches socialism fever, let's listen to the other big winner in last Tuesday's election, Virginia Governor-elect Abigail Spanberger, who, before the 24 election, said things like, "If the party didn't shift to the center, we will get torn apart. And we need to never use the word socialist or socialism ever again." Well, she was right, but they didn't listen. Typical, am I right, lady? One wing is saying don't ever use the word socialist again, and one is saying,
I am a Democratic Socialist!
Clear, huh? So how do we decide who's right?
Maher's critique, in this framing, shifts from economics into pure political strategy. His argument is that the Democratic Party's internal split isn't just theoretical, it has real electoral consequences. From his perspective, the more progressive or socialist-leaning wing of the party is often speaking in a language that resonates strongly within activist circles, but struggles to connect with broader, everyday concerns outside those spaces. That disconnect, he argues, becomes most visible when it meets the realities of national elections, where voter priorities tend to be more practical than ideological. His suggested remedy is a return toward the political center, less emphasis on ideological purity tests, and more focus on issues that cut across party lines. Cost of living, public safety, economic stability, and trust in government performance. Whether one agrees or not, the core tension he's pointing to is a familiar one in American politics. How a major party balances its activist base with the preferences of the broader electorate. In his view, when that balance tilts too far in one direction, the political cost shows up at the ballot box.
Democratic socialism is like a dating profile. Things look great until you meet up in the real world. For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor in the Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mandani are not Democrats. they'll be the first to tell you that. They're Democratic Socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think people know that yet.
Before I rewrite your paragraph, it's worth grounding one key thing. The claims being made here mix real debates with very strong ideological framing. Countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and the Soviet Union are often cited in arguments about socialism, but economists and historians disagree heavily on why those systems struggled, ranging from resource dependence and sanctions to governance failures, global market pressures, and structural inefficiencies. It's rarely as simple as ideology alone caused collapse. Here's a rewritten and more polished version of your paragraph that keeps your tone but makes it more balanced, coherent, and impactful. And this is where Maher shifts from commentator to sharp political critic, cutting straight to the core of the debate. His argument is that these democratic socialists aren't just misguided on policy, they risk pulling the party further away from the voters it needs most. From his perspective, messaging rooted in ideology often clashes with the everyday concerns of ordinary Americans, including workers, small business owners, and the middle class. And when that happens, it becomes politically costly, as elections tend to reflect practical concerns more than theoretical visions. He believes the solution is not radical reinvention, but realignment, bringing the party closer to the center. Less focus on ideological purity, more attention to issues like cost of living, public safety, jobs, and economic stability. And his view, the Democratic Party didn't necessarily lose because of one moment or one message. It drifted away from the political middle, and in doing so, lost connection with the voters who live there.
This is against why people sometimes, I think, question some of what you're saying. This is a survey student loan forgiveness recipients. 73% of applicants say they are likely to spend their extra money on non-essential, including vacations, smartphone, drugs, and alcohol. They admitted that to the pollster.
Who is this pollster?
NBC News. 52% they are very likely to buy new clothing. 46% they would use the money for vacation and eat out at restaurants.
And that observation cuts straight to the heart of the entire debate. The uncomfortable reality is that socialism has always carried a powerful appeal, and that's exactly what makes it so controversial. On paper, it presents an almost ideal vision: equality for all, shared prosperity, and a system where no one is left behind. It sounds noble, even poetic. But critics argue that when these ideas are implemented at scale, the outcomes often diverge sharply from the theory. Historical examples frequently cited in this debate include the Soviet Union, Cuba, and Venezuela, cases where centrally planned or heavily state-controlled systems faced severe economic challenges and declining living standards over time. Supporters of socialism, however, push back on this interpretation, arguing that these outcomes are tied to specific political conditions, governance failures, external pressures, and the difficulty of managing large complex economies, not simply the ideology itself. The definition of socialism also varies widely, from full state planning to modern democratic socialist models that still operate within mixed market systems. Despite these debates, the tension remains. Critics point to historical struggles as evidence of systemic flaws, while supporters argue those examples are either misrepresented or incomplete. And that divide is precisely why the discussion continues to persist, generation after generation.
The kids think that stuff that happened before their appearance on the planet didn't really happen, but it did. We've run this experiment many times, and the results are always obvious. Here's capitalist South Korea at night from space. Here's socialist North Korea. Yeah. In 1990, Venezuela was wealthier than Poland. But then Poland, finally free of Soviet-style economics, went all in on capitalism. And now their economy is as big as Japan. And people there have high wages, low inflation, cars, vacations, homes.
Maher doesn't just speak in theory. He leans on history and lets the record speak for itself. One by one, he points to the cautionary examples of nations that embraced sweeping socialist experiments and paid the price in economic collapse and instability. Venezuela is often cited as the most recent case, a country once rich in oil wealth that descended into hyperinflation, shortages, and mass emigration amid severe economic mismanagement. Cuba, meanwhile, remains trapped in decades of low growth, rationing, and restricted economic freedom under a rigid state-controlled system. And the Soviet Union, once a global superpower, ultimately disintegrated after years of structural inefficiencies, stagnation, and systemic strain under central planning. To critics like Maher, these aren't isolated stories, they form a pattern. Large-scale centralized economic control, they argue, has repeatedly struggled to deliver long-term prosperity or stability at national scale. From there, the argument escalates into something more provocative. The idea that modern advocates of socialism believe today's advanced economies could somehow succeed where others failed. With cutting-edge technology, globalized trade, and modern institutions, they suggest the United States might avoid the same outcomes. But Maher's position is blunt. Economic realities, in his view, don't bend to optimism or national confidence. Systems that struggle under structural incentives, productivity constraints, and centralized control tend to produce similar outcomes regardless of geography or intent. The core claim, as critics frame it, is not just about execution, it's about design. And that's where the debate becomes most heated. Whether the failures attributed to socialism are accidental misapplications of an idea, or predictable outcomes of the system itself.
I don't think people realize we already have a lot of socialism. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, food stamps, veterans benefits, Pell Grants, COVID-era payments, farm subsidies, disability payments, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, corporate bailouts, and the jobs program that is building weapons the Pentagon doesn't even want. All that is socialism, much of it appropriate to soften the edges of capitalism, but the DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. They're for what Biden was doing, but more.
So there it is, Bill Maher, never one to sugarcoat or soften uncomfortable truths, once again laying out his version of economic and political reality. In his view, the idea that simply taxing the wealthy harder is the ultimate solution misses the bigger picture. The issue, he argues, has never been purely about how much money comes in, but about how effectively it is managed once it enters a complex and often inefficient system. Meanwhile, broader concerns remain. The middle class continues to feel pressure, poverty has not disappeared despite massive levels of government spending, and debates over socialism and redistribution remain deeply polarizing rather than resolved. To its core, this is a clash of visions about how society should function, how resources should be allocated, and what role government should play in shaping outcomes. And that disagreement isn't fading anytime soon. One thing is clear. American voters have historically leaned more toward market-driven solutions than fully centralized economic models, and that political reality continues to shape elections. If the Democratic Party misreads that sentiment or drifts too far from it, the consequences in future elections could be significant. As always, drop your thoughts below, and we'll see you in the next one.